I want to be upfront about something before I tell you this story. I am not a man who makes mistakes. I run 42,000 acres of Texas cattle ranch with the same precision I apply to everything else in my life. Every fence post accounted for, every head of cattle logged, every employee vetted twice before they set foot on my property. I don't do impulsive. I don't do reckless. And I absolutely, categorically, do not spend the night with a woman whose last name I don't know and whose face I only see clearly in the golden light of a roadside motel lamp. I don't do that. Or at least, I hadn't. Until the Thursday before she started working for me, which I did not know at the time, because if I had known, I would have made very different choices. Starting with staying home that night instead of driving 40 miles into Danner County because my truck needed parts, and my ranch hand Jake needed a night off from my company, and I, apparently, needed to walk into the only bar in Merritt and sit down next to a woman with dark auburn hair, quiet brown eyes, and absolutely no interest in who I was or what I owned. That was the first thing that got me. She didn't know. She just didn't know, and that changed everything. Her name was Josie Calloway. She was sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing something that looked like sweet tea, reading a worn paperback with a cracked spine, wearing a simple blue dress and sneakers that had seen better days. She had a canvas backpack propped against the stool beside her like it was her travel companion. I sat 2 stools down because those were the only seats left. I didn't intend to speak to her. I ordered a beer, checked my phone, and minded my own business for approximately 7 minutes before she looked up from her book, glanced at me sideways, and said, "You look like a man who just lost an argument with himself." I blinked. I said, "Excuse me?" She closed the book on her thumb. "You've been staring at your phone for 7 minutes without looking at it once. Either you're avoiding a call or you're arguing with yourself about something. I'm guessing the second one. I want to be clear, no one talks to me like that. I am Wade Whitfield. My family has owned the largest cattle operation in this county for 3 generations. People in this part of Texas do not look me in the eye and guess at my internal state like they're reading a menu. But Josie Calloway didn't know that. And so she just kept looking at me, waiting, with this small, patient expression that was neither flirtatious nor afraid, just genuinely curious, like she'd asked a reasonable question and expected a reasonable answer. I didn't know what to do with that, so I told the truth. I said, "Yeah, the second one." She nodded like that was entirely expected, went back to her book, and said, "Hope you win." That was it. That was all she said. And I sat there staring at my beer thinking, who is this woman? We talked for 2 hours. I don't do that either, for the record. I don't sit at a bar and talk to strangers for 2 hours. But she was, I don't have a better word for it, easy. Not in any way that diminishes her, because there was nothing simple about Josie Calloway once she got going. Now, she had opinions about cattle ranching that were surprisingly informed for someone who said she'd only just moved to this part of Texas. She had a quiet, dry humor that snuck up on you sideways and hit you before you realized you were laughing. She had a way of listening that made you want to keep talking, not because she was flattering you, but because you could tell she was actually paying attention. I told her things I don't tell people. Not deep secrets, just real things. About the ranch, about the land, about what it felt like to be responsible for something that large. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Do you actually love it? Or do you just love that you're good at it?" I stared at her. She said, "There's a difference." I said, "I know there's a difference." She raised an eyebrow and waited. I said, and this surprised me while I was saying it, Both, but the first one more. She smiled then. Not a big smile. Just a small, warm, real one that did something strange to my chest. I ordered another beer. If you enjoy stories like this one, subscribe to the channel right now and tell me in the comments, would you have recognized him? Drop your answer and I'll leave a heart on it. I will not describe in detail what happened next because this is not that kind of story, and because what happened next was gentler than I expected, which is the part that stayed with me. I'll say this, she was honest about it. She said, "I don't do this either, just so you know." I believed her. I still believe her. We ended up at the motel 2 blocks down because her rental car had died in the parking lot and she'd already checked out of her room. And I made a decision that I could not entirely explain at the time and have not entirely explained since. I know this. I watched her fall asleep in the amber light from the window, and I felt something settle in me that had been restless for longer than I cared to admit. I didn't analyze it. I left before dawn, quietly, because she had a new job to get to in the morning, and I had 42,000 acres waiting. I drove home in the dark with the windows down and the Texas air hot and still around me, and I thought, I will probably never see her again. That's all I thought. I was very wrong. I pulled up to my main gate at 6:45 in the morning to find my ranch foreman, Dale Merritt, standing beside his truck with a clipboard and a cup of coffee, and the particular expression he gets when he needs to tell me something I'm not going to like. I rolled down my window. He said, "Good morning, boss." I said, "What is it?" He said, "New hires arriving at 7, the livestock records coordinator position." I stared at him. I said, "I thought that wasn't until next week." He said, "You approved the new start date 3 weeks ago." He handed me the email chain. I had, in fact, approved it. I looked at the timestamp and pinched the bridge of my nose and said, "Fine, have Jake show them the main office." Dale said, "Sure thing," and then paused, which meant there was more. I said, "What?" He said, "It's a woman. Her name's Calloway. References were excellent. She knows cattle record systems." He kept talking. I stopped hearing him after the word Calloway. I want to be very precise about what happened at 7:03 that morning, because I have replayed it more times than I will ever admit to another living soul. I was standing at the fence near the east stable, ostensibly checking the gate latch, in reality buying myself 60 seconds before I had to go act normal in the main yard, when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. I turned. She was walking up the drive from where Jake had parked her rental. A different rental, I noticed, which meant she'd dealt with the car situation. Wearing dark jeans, a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and the same worn sneakers from last night. Her auburn hair was pulled back. She had the canvas backpack over one shoulder. She was looking down at a folded piece of paper, probably directions, and she hadn't looked up yet. I had approximately 3 seconds. I used them to do absolutely nothing useful, which is not something I can say has happened to me since I was 19 years old. Then she looked up. Her eyes found me. And the exact sequence of what crossed her face is something I have memorized in detail because it was the most genuinely unguarded expression I have ever witnessed in my adult life. First, recognition. Then, confusion. Then, and this is the part that I will tell my grandchildren about someday, her eyes went wide and she said out loud, with no filter whatsoever, "Oh no," I said, "Morning." She closed her eyes briefly, opened them, said, "Please tell me you're a ranch hand." I said, "No." She looked at the sky, then back at me, then at the main house behind me. The sprawling, immaculate, an unmistakably expensive main house, and said, "How big is this ranch?" I said, 42,000 acres. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I said, "I'm Wade Whitfield." She said, "I'm Josie Calloway." I said, "I know." There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds and felt like 4 years. Then she straightened her spine, adjusted the backpack strap, and said, "Okay, I'd like to be professionally evaluated on my work and nothing else, please." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "That's what I was already going to do." She said, "Good." I said, "Good." She walked past me toward the main office. I stood there by the fence for another full minute before Jake appeared at my elbow and said, "Boss, you good?" I said, "Go away, Jake." He went away, but I could hear him smiling from 6 feet in the other direction, which is something I did not think was physically possible until that morning. Here is what I knew about Josie Calloway by the end of her first week. She was the most organized person I had ever encountered in 20 years of running this operation. My cattle records had been maintained adequately for years, efficiently enough, nothing to complain about. But Josie walked in, spent 3 days reviewing the existing system, and on Thursday afternoon, she left a 14-page reorganization proposal on my desk with a handwritten note on top that said simply, "Your current system works. This one works better. Your call." I read the whole thing. It was meticulous and creative at the same time, which I had not expected. Every suggestion was practical. Every projected time savings was realistic. I approved every item, signed it, walked it back down to her office, and left it on her desk. She found it before lunch. She knocked on my office door and said, "All of it?" I said, "All of it." She held the folder for a moment and said, "Most people ask me to justify my reasoning." I said, "You justified it in the document." She looked at me, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Something softened or maybe opened. I'm not sure which. She said, "Thank you." I said, "It's a good system." She nodded and left. I stared at the door for 10 seconds and then made myself go back to the quarterly budget numbers, which I had been looking at for 40 minutes without actually reading them. Here is the thing about trying to keep things professional when you already know how a person sounds when they're falling asleep. It is not simple. I had done harder things. I had weathered 2 droughts and a cattle disease outbreak, and a lawsuit from a neighboring property that took 3 years to resolve. I could manage this. I managed it by being exactly what I had always been: calm, direct, fair, present when work required it, and unavailable otherwise. I did not linger in the records office. I did not find excuses to ask her questions I already knew the answers to. I did not watch her cross the yard from the kitchen window in the mornings when she arrived. I did that last one once. Jake caught me. I told him I was watching the weather. He said, "Yes, sir," with his eyes facing directly forward and his jaw doing that thing it does when he's trying not to laugh. I moved away from the window. The thing that broke me, and I mean that in the best possible way, and in the way that Josie herself would one day describe as cracking a window in a stuffy room, was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when the sky went the color of a bruise and the wind came up fast from the south and the horses got nervous. I was in the south pasture when the storm hit, and by the time I got back to the main yard, the rain was coming down sideways. I jogged to the porch and found Josie already there, standing at the railing watching the lightning roll across the distant ridge with her arms folded, and this expression on her face that I can only describe as reverent. Like the storm was doing something for her that she'd needed. She didn't hear me come up behind her, and for a moment I just stood there, which I recognize was not my most professional behavior. But in my defense, the rain was loud, and the light was strange, and she looked like she'd been painted there. Then she said, without turning, "I love Texas storms." I said, "Most people run from them." She glanced back at me. "That's because most people think shelter is the opposite of wild." She turned back to the rain. I stood beside her. Neither of us said anything for a while, which was the most comfortable silence I had experienced in years. Finally, she said, "How long do they usually last out here?" I said, "This one? Hour? Maybe 2. She nodded. "Good," she said. "I've got nowhere to be." I thought, neither do I. I did not say it, but I stayed on that porch for 2 hours, and she stayed beside me. So when the storm did exactly what Texas storms do. It came in wild and loud, and then gradually softened into something slower and quieter and steady. And by the time it passed, the air smelled like wet grass and cedar, and the sky had gone every shade of gold and pink that the light knows. She looked at that sky and said quietly, "Worth it." I looked at her. "Yeah," I said. "It was." She turned to find me looking at her, and not the sky, and she didn't look away, and I didn't either, for about 5 seconds. Then she said, "Good night, Wade," and picked up her bag from where she'd set it against the porch post and walked to her truck. I watched her go. Jake, who I had not noticed leaning against the barn wall under the overhang 20 feet away, said, "Boss?" I said, "Don't." He said, I wasn't going to say a word." He had the audacity to be whistling when he walked away. Before we get to the best part, subscribe to the channel right now and comment, "Did you see this ending coming?" Tell me below, and I'll leave you a heart. It took me 3 more weeks to do anything about it, which I am not proud of, but which I think was necessary. I needed to be sure. I don't do things I'm not sure about. I needed to know that what I was feeling wasn't about that night in Merritt, wasn't nostalgia or convenience or proximity, that it was actually her, specifically, irreplaceably her, that was doing this to me. I watched her work. I watched her with the other ranch hands, who liked her immediately and genuinely, not in the easy social way people sometimes perform, but in the real way. They asked her questions and actually listened to her answers, and she learned their names in the first week, all 12 of them, and remembered details about their families and asked follow-up questions the following Monday that surprised every single one of them, including Dale, who has been here for 11 years and who told me privately, "She's good people, boss, the real kind." I watched her with the horses, which is always the truest test of a person as far as I'm concerned. She was patient and unhurried, and she spoke to them quietly, like they had thoughts worth considering, which they do. And they responded to her the way horses respond to someone who actually means it. I watched her in the late afternoons when she thought she was alone in the records office, singing softly to herself while she worked, the same 2 songs on rotation, and I never told her I could hear it from the hallway, because some things you keep for yourself. I knew. By the end of those 3 weeks, I knew exactly what it was. I told her on a Friday evening at the end of October, which was not planned. What was planned was a straightforward conversation about the Q4 inventory system she'd proposed. What happened instead was that she came into my office at 5:30, sat across the desk, slid a folder across to me, and said, "Section 3 is the complicated part. Do you want me to walk you through it, or do you want to read it first?" And I looked at the folder, and then I looked at her, and I said, "I need to tell you something before we talk about the inventory system." She stilled slightly. I said, "I know this is complicated. I know you came here to do a job, and you've done it exceptionally well, and you deserve to have that be the whole story. But I have been not indifferent to you since the first morning you walked up this drive. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise any longer because I don't see the point in it." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Wade." I said, "You don't have to say anything right now." She said, "I've been waiting for you to say that for 5 weeks." I blinked. She said, "I kept thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Or maybe I was hoping you'd imagined it because it would be simpler." She folded her hands on the desk. "It isn't simpler." I said, "No." She said, "I don't know what we do with this." I said, "I'd like to figure it out, if you're willing." She looked out the window at the last of the evening light lying across the south pasture. Then she looked back at me and said, "I think I'd like that too." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 5 weeks. She picked up the inventory folder and said, "Okay, section 3. I almost laughed. I said, "Right now?" She said, "I'm a professional, Wade." She said it perfectly straight-faced, and then the corner of her mouth moved, and I did laugh, and she looked at me with those quiet brown eyes, warm and certain, and I thought, this woman, this impossible, extraordinary, completely unexpected woman, she's going to ruin me in the best possible way. She did, for the record. She absolutely did. We took it slow. Slower than either of us would have chosen if we weren't both careful people who'd been hurt before and who valued what we were building more than the speed at which we built it. She kept her professional life clean and precise the way she did everything, and I kept mine, and we were careful and respectful and honest. And we discovered over the course of that fall and winter that honesty, when it's extended to every corner of two people's shared life, is the most romantic thing in the world. She had dinner with me on the porch 3 weeks after that Friday conversation, the first night the temperature dropped enough to need a jacket, and I made something that barely counted as cooking, but she ate it without complaint and said, "This is good," with such genuine sincerity that I laughed again, which was happening with some regularity now, much to Jake's visible delight. I told her things I hadn't told another person in years, about my father's death, about the weight of the land, about the loneliness that comes with being responsible for something so large that no one ever asks how you're doing with it. She listened to all of it with the same patient, honest attention she gave everything. Then she said, "I'm going to ask you how you're doing with it, going forward, if that's all right." I said, "More than all right." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and that was the moment. Not the bar in Merritt, not the porch in the storm, and not the inventory system that we never actually finished discussing that Friday. That was the moment I understood what had been settling in me since the first night I watched her fall asleep in the amber light. It was her. It had always been going to be her, in whatever version of my life she walked into. I'd just been lucky enough that she walked into this one. She moved into the main house that spring. Her choice, her timeline. I made no demands and had none. She brought 3 boxes, the canvas backpack, and a small framed photograph of her mother that she put on the kitchen windowsill. That was it. She had lived light for a long time, she told me, and I told her, "You can put down roots now, if you want them." She looked around the kitchen, at the wide windows and the morning light and the south pasture stretching out to the horizon, and then she looked at me, and she said, "I think I already have." I pulled her into my arms, right there in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, with my coffee getting cold on the counter, and the ranch hands starting to arrive in the yard, and I held her like she was the most important thing on 42,000 acres, because she was, because she is, because that is simply the truth of it. Jake walked past the kitchen window, saw us, and gave the sky a private little nod that I pretended not to notice, because some things you let a man have. I had exactly one rule about my ranch when this story started. And then Josie Calloway showed up on a Tuesday morning with a canvas backpack and brown eyes that didn't know who I was, and I threw the rule out, and I have never once missed it. She is sitting on the porch right now, reading the same kind of worn paperback she was reading the night I met her, barefoot, with the late afternoon light going gold across the fields. She knows as well as I do now. She looked up when I started telling this story and said, "Are you going to be honest?" I said, "Always." She smiled and went back to her book. That's the whole story. That's every bit of it. A man who thought he had everything figured out, and a woman who proved him wrong in the most magnificent way possible, starting on a Thursday night in a bar in Merritt County and finishing here, on this porch, in this light, for as long as the Texas sky stays wide above us.